AP Biology Review, second quarter, part 8. Now we're going to talk about some things beyond Mendel that he didn't know about that are important to the study of genetics. The first thing we're going to talk about is pleiotropy. Pleiotropy is where one gene has multiple effects. For example, if you get the mutated gene for the proteins in your lungs for transport of salt, or the mutated gene for hemoglobin or some other things, what happens is that one gene causes a whole bunch of problems. For cystic fibrosis, your lungs fill up with phlegm, you have difficulty breathing, your organs get coated with mucus. There's a whole bunch of other things that happen as a result of just one gene being affected, and that's called pleiotropy, is when one gene has multiple effects. Many genes are pleiotropic, or have multiple effects in living things. Epistasis. Epi means on top of, and we're talking about one gene turning on another gene. And in this case, we have the pigment gene that has to be turned on before you can make pigment in mice. And if you don't get the pigment gene, you have a lack of pigment, or an albino or white mouse. So here we have recessive gene, little c, little c, little c. All these mice don't have any pigments, even though they have the alleles for black and brown fur color. Since they don't have the pigment gene turned on, they got two of the recessive alleles. That gene had to be turned on first. It's on top of, or epi, the pigment gene, and they'll all appear white. Now, if you get the dominant allele for pigment in mice, then the other gene can be turned on. You can make pigment. So in this case, we have C, big C, and that's homozygous dominant. So you have the allele for making pigment, which means that you can either be black or brown as a mouse color. If you have big B, that's dominant, black is dominant to brown, so the mouse appears black. If you have two of the recessive alleles, homozygous recessive, then the mouse will appear brown. But you don't become black or brown as a mouse unless you first have the dominant allele for pigment. Polygenic, more than one gene controlling a trait. Skin color is polygenic. It's controlled by three separate genes. And here we have the genes for the first amount of melanin that can be made, the second amount of melanin being made, and the third amount of melanin being made. Now, it's a combination of dominant alleles that gives you your skin color. If you do just the cross for big A, little a, big A, little a, you could have two of the dominant or the melanin alleles, you could have two of the no melanin alleles, or you can have one of each. And if you do the cross for each one of these three genes for skin color, you could either have lots and lots of melanin, you get a whole bunch of homozygous dominance for melanin, or you could be homozygous recessive for all three traits and produce no melanin, and you get everything in between. And that's polygenic, or more than one gene controlling skin color. A lot of human traits are polygenic, where there's more than one gene that affects a single characteristic, and here's a list of some of them. We have sex-linked traits that are on the X chromosome. Now, there are some problems that could happen with the Y chromosome, but the Y chromosome doesn't have that much genetic information to begin with. So it's usually the X chromosome that has problems. So sex-linked traits are usually also called X-linked traits. And this is problems that happen on the sex chromosomes, the 23rd pair. Although differences between women and men are many, the chromosomal basis of sex is very simple. If you're a female, you get two X's. If you're a male, you're XY. Now, the reason why that's significant is that if there's some defective gene on the X chromosome, if the male gets a defective X chromosome, they cannot have a normal X chromosome to kind of hide it if it's a recessive trait. If a female gets a recessive disorder on her X chromosome, if she has the normal allele on her other X chromosome, she's not going to have the trait. She'll be a carrier. So it's kind of like a backup copy for females that men don't have. So how do these things get spread? It's usually the carriers that spread it, because most people that have the disease don't spread it. They don't want to give it to the kids. So let's say we have a female with hemophilia, and that's a recessive sex-linked disorder, not on the 22 pairs of autosomes, but on the 23rd pair of X chromosome for both males and females. So here we have a carrier. The woman also has the dominant allele for the normal clotting factor. Hemophilia basically is a failure for your blood to clot, and you could bleed to death very easily. This male here has the dominant allele, big H, so he's not going to have hemophilia. And let's say they get married, and she might not even know that she's recessive, a carrier for this trait. You would only know if it was in your family and someone told you. So the male can produce these two types of sperm as far as sex chromosomes. The female has the possibility of producing eggs with the normal allele or the hemophilia allele. Now, if you notice here, both females are not going to have the disease. However, there is a possibility, a 25% chance of the children of the female being a carrier and having one of the allele, but she'll be just fine. The males, well, if you have a male, there's a 50% chance of having a male with the disease. Now, if mom gives the son a dominant allele, the kid's just fine and no hemophilia. But if the mom gives the hemophilia allele, represented by little h, then the son will have little h and y, and since there's no X chromosome to hide that little h, the son will definitely have the disease. Now keep in mind these are carried on the X chromosome, and males only have Y chromosomes to give to their sons. So men never pass on X-linked chromosome disorders to their sons because they don't give the son an X chromosome. In fact, the only way a daughter can get a hemophilia or sex-linked trait is if the male has the disease, let's say he's little h, and the female is at least a carrier. Then you could have little h, and the daughter would have hemophilia. However, if the male did have hemophilia, there's a good chance that he would decide not to have children if he was worried about passing on that disease. So women tend to be carriers of sex-linked traits. Men tend to actually have the disease. The other two sex-linked traits that you should know, in addition to hemophilia, is muscular dystrophy, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and red-green color blindness, are all characterized by defective X chromosomes. X inactivation, one of the two X chromosomes in females become inactivated during embryological development and turn into a bar body. And in cats, there's information on that X chromosome for fur color. So if you inactivate the brown fur allele on the X chromosome, then all the cells that come from that cell by mitosis will have the black fur allele turned on, and all those cells will make the black fur spots. And the opposite is true. If the black fur alleles on the inactivated X chromosome, the inactivated bar body, then the brown fur allele will be the one that's expressed for all the cells that come from that and produce brown fur in that the cells that were divided during embryological development and later on in the cat's life. That's the same thing that's going on with tortoiseshell cats. It's either orange fur or black fur, depending on which one gets turned off and becomes a bar body, determines what color fur is being made from that group of cells. Male pattern baldness. For males, baldness is a dominant allele, or dominant trait. So if you get the baldness allele, you'll definitely go bald, no matter what you have as far as your other chromosome. However, for females, it's a recessive trait. You have to have 2 of the recessive allele for women to be bald in females. Women can go bald, but you have to get the allele from both mom and dad. Whereas if the males get even 1 allele, it's dominant in males, so they're definitely going to go bald. Nature and nurture, that's basically, nature is genetics, nurture is the environment. Is it genetics, is it environment? Well, it's usually both. And human skin color, you can make it darker by tanning, but you're also born with your skin color based on those polygenic genes that control it. Then we have the color of hydrangeas. In normal soil they're blue. In acidic soil they're going to turn purplish. So they're affected by the soil pH in addition to their genetics that they got from their parents. Pedigree analysis, you can look at a shaded area as having the trait that's being analyzed, and squares represent males, circles females, and you can kind of try to figure out what the parents were in order to figure out the genotypes of different people in this pedigree. For example, if you have a dominant trait represented by big W, this person has the allele. This person could be big W, little w, or big W for widow's peak, that little point in the middle there. And this person has to be big W, little w, because if you cross it with a person without the widow's peak, little w, the only way to get children with no widow's peak is to get 1 little w from one parent, 1 little w from the other parent. Now this parent's definitely going to give 1 little w, but if this parent was big W, that means that all the kids would be big W, little w, and all would have widow's peak. So that's one thing to look for when you're looking at these traits. If all the males are getting a disease, then it's more likely to be a sex-linked trait. If everyone's getting the disease, it's probably a dominant disorder. But again, you can kind of analyze the offspring and try to figure out what kind of trait it is. A lot of these diseases are recessive alleles because they hide in the carriers. Some of the recessive traits are things like Tay-Sachs, malfunctioning lipids or enzymes that break down lipids in the brain. Cystic fibrosis is a protein channel that doesn't work in mainly Caucasian populations. Tay-Sachs affects mainly Jewish populations. And sickle cell anemia affects mainly African populations, and it's inability to make normal hemoglobin, which causes the cells to sickle. Genetic testing, something called amniocentesis. Doctors pull out a sample of the fluid called the amniotic fluid, and inside that fluid are cells that you can do a karyotype on to see if the kid's going to have extra chromosomes and such. Recessive diseases are usually passed on by carriers because they don't know they have the disease. And this is how they get passed on. A normal person, let's say it's a normal allele for cystic not having cystic fibrosis. This person has no history of it. This person does have the allele, and then we have a cross, and now we have some carriers. Now these carriers, if they meet someone else with the same disease, carried, hidden, the little a represents the hidden disease. These two people have a chance of making a kid with little a. By the way, that's one reason why you don't want to marry your brother or sister. If they have any unknown genetic disorders, and other than the U factor, in addition to that, any lethal recessive alleles, and many of us, if not all of us, have some, you have a 25% chance of passing it on to the children, and that causes a lot of problems as far as, possibly killing the kid. So typically these diseases get spread by the carriers of diseases that don't know they have it hidden within them. Cystic fibrosis affects mainly Europeans, white Europeans descent, and it's an inability to transport chlorine out of the cells of the lungs, which has some problems with osmosis. So here's the lung airspace, here's the protein that doesn't work, and here's the salt that's supposed to be pumped out. Now normally the salt gets pumped out by active transport, makes it hypertonic out here. Water follows by osmosis, making your mucus in your lungs nice and fluid. However, if you have the damaged DNA that causes the cystic fibrosis problem, the protein doesn't work, doesn't pump out the salt, this doesn't become hypertonic, the water does not follow by osmosis, and the mucus in the lungs gets really thick and gooey, and the person is basically drowning on their own snot. And that's cystic fibrosis. Tay-Sachs, another autosomal recessive disorder, affects mainly Jews of Eastern European populations. This is just where the mutation first happened and got spread. And this is non-functioning enzymes inside lysosomes that break down lipids in brain cells. So the brain cells get crowded with lipids, and the child usually dies by the time they're 5. We have sickle cell that affects mainly Africans. It's where the mutation first occurred. And there's one DNA sequence that's messed up that causes the hemoglobin protein that carries oxygen to misfold improperly. And that's going to cause the whole cell to sickle. This is pleiotropic. That's one gene causing multiple effects, like heart attack, stroke, muscle pain, etc. So look at what the normal amino acid sequences in hemoglobin. Now this goes on and on for thousands, at least hundreds of amino acids. But because of one DNA mutation in the 6th amino acid, you're going to get the wrong amino acid. You're going to get valine instead of glutamine. And then the valine causes the whole red blood cell to sickle. Now it's not the hemoglobin that's sickled. It's the blood cell with the 250,000, quarter of a million misfolded hemoglobin that causes the cell to sickle. So it's not the hemoglobin sickling, it's the hemoglobin misfolding that causes the red blood cell to sickle and get caught up in arteries and blood vessels and causes all kinds of problems. Here's pleiotropy here, the one gene having multiple effects. Look at all these pleiotropic effects. Sickle cell phenotype, it's codominant, so if you get the normal allele and the sickle allele, you'll produce some normal red blood cells and some sickle cells, big A, little a. It's not really little a, it's codominant, so we could make it AS, but that's heterozygotes can survive their condition. And they have an advantage in places with malaria. Malaria doesn't infect the sickle cells, so if you get one of each, the heterozygotes have enough regular hemoglobin to keep themselves alive, and they have enough sickle cells to prevent them from getting malaria. So in places like Africa with malaria, they have an advantage. Homozygous normal folks die of the malaria. Homozygous recessive die of the sickle cell. But heterozygotes, they got something going for them. And that ends our review for second quarter.